We'd like to introduce you all to our very first webinar this afternoon. Apologies for our slight technical difficulties. We'll be first starting off with Dieter Kogler, who will be introducing this afternoon's session.
Thank you, Alex. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you. A very warm welcome to our inaugural Regional Cities Industry webinar series. Today we are welcoming close to 700 participants from 67 countries. Like Alex said, my name is Dieter Kogler, University College Dublin, and I'm the RSA board member working on conferences and events. So up front, I just want to say a few introductory words before we hand over to our speaker, discussant, and chair. I hope this finds all well, safe in these challenging times. So while we all try to adjust to the current situation, the RSA continues to work very hard to support its members and the community. There's two new webinar series we have installed, one about career development, and there's also a new grant scheme that funds research on how regional cities and industries deal with the impact of the coronavirus crisis. More details, please confer to our RSA website. There will be also further information in the email that will follow this webinar. This leaves me now to hand over to our Deputy Editor of Regional Studies, Jennifer Clark, who will introduce our speaker and our discussants for today's webinar series. Enjoy.
Thank you so much, Dieter and Alex as well for that introduction. And welcome to everyone who is joining us from around the world. My name is Jennifer Clark. I'm a professor and head of the City and Regional Planning section in the Knowlton School of Architecture at The Ohio State University. And as Dieter mentioned, I'm also the Deputy Editor-in-Chief of Regional Studies. And it is my honor to introduce the Regional Studies Annual Lecture and chair this session with our two distinguished speakers today. As you may know, the Regional Studies Annual Lecture is usually delivered at the American Association of Geographers annual meeting. And this lecture, as with its predecessors, was actually intended originally for that venue. Much planning goes into that event by the speakers, the RSA staff and board, the regional studies editors, and our publisher, Taylor and Francis. And often there is quite a bit of specialist expertise provided by Dieter on both the venue and the time for that event. So this remote production of the Regional Studies Annual Lecture, like its face-to-face cousin, required a great deal of effort to put together, and we thank the Regional Studies Association team for doing that work. In these troubled times, as Dieter mentioned, I just would like to direct everyone to the editorial statement put out by the editors and the editorial teams from all the Regional Studies Association journals, including Regional Studies. It's available on the Regional Studies Association website for those of you who have not seen it. Just to summarize it briefly, Regional Studies is moving forward with the incredible support of the team of editors, staff, reviewers, authors, and our publisher. We are all here, we are working, and we are depending on you, our community. We know we have much to contribute to the conversation, the conversations to come. That said, we understand that everyone is working under extremely challenging circumstances. Things will not be the same, and we will work together to plot that path forward. So I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts before moving to the introductions of our distinguished speakers. First, you know, in my house through this time, we've had three goals that we keep in mind. The first is to stay healthy, and I hope everyone is doing that. The second is to keep it together. And we have some regional variations on how we say that, but I will not work blue today. And if we have a handle on 1 and 2, what we try to do is we try to be present for a community we care about and help hold it together. And I just want to thank you personally and on behalf of Regional Studies for being present today and part of this intentional, international, interdisciplinary community that we have built together here. So let me now turn to the introduction of our distinguished speakers. Our main speaker today is Professor Henry Young from the National University of Singapore, where he is a distinguished professor in the Department of Geography. He is the author of Strategic Coupling, East Asian Industrial Transformation in the New Global Economy, published in 2016 from Cornell University Press, as well as Global Production Networks, Theorizing Economic Development in an Interconnected World with Neil Coe, which was published by Oxford in 2015. He is also the author of more than 100 academic articles, and his work has been recognized by the American Association of Geographers when he was awarded the AAG Distinguished Scholarship honor in 2018, and also by the Royal Geographical Society with the Murchison Award in 2017. The lecture that he will be delivering for us today is entitled Regional Worlds from Related Variety in Regional Diversification to Strategic Coupling in Global Production Networks. And before Professor Young begins to speak, I also want to take the time to introduce our discussant, who is Professor Andres Rodriguez Pose from the London School of Economics. As many of you know, the way we like to do these lectures is we do the main presentation, and we also have a discussant who has prepared remarks as well. So Professor Rodriguez Pose his research is widely cited in academic circles and policy circles as well. He has worked for many and advises many different governmental and non-governmental associations, including the European Commission, the World Bank, the OECD, the International Labor Organization, the Inter-American Development Bank, and many, many others. He is the recent past president of the Regional Science Association International, and in 2018 received the ERSA Prize in Regional Science. And with that introduction, I would like to turn the microphone over to Professor Henry Young.
Thank you. Thank you, Jennifer. I hope all of you can hear me. Hello, my name is Henry Young. Greetings from the tropical Singapore with my garden as the virtual background. Let me share the slide for this presentation. Okay, I hope all of you can see the slides, and I shall begin today's presentation. I will speak for roughly about 35 minutes, so it won't be too long. First of all, let me thank the editors of Regional Studies, Jennifer, Dieter, and others, as well as the Regional Studies Association for inviting me to deliver this 2020 annual lecture. I would like to also thank, of course, Andreas for taking on this unenviable task of having to read the full paper, which was already written, and give today's comments. Thank you very much. Okay, without further ado, I shall move on with the presentation. Okay, after a brief introduction of the key issues at stake, which you probably get a sense from the abstract itself, I will then move on to the first major section, in which I would like to reconceptualize regional worlds as the main title of the article or the paper, in order for us to reconcile perhaps two strands of major literature in regional studies, the evolutionary economic geography and global production network studies. So in the third section, I shall try make an attempt to, if you like, relate related variety to strategic coupling, the two key concepts in the respective literature. And if I have time, I shall spend a bit of effort to address some perhaps future research agenda. Now, some 30 years ago, regional studies underwent major debates on regional changes and transformations from a kind of more Fordist mass production to post-Fordist flexible specialization. That debate was very, very significant at the time when I was doing my PhD in Manchester. That's the time also when Michael Stopper published his 1993 very important paper in regional studies entitled Regional Worlds of Production, as you can tell from which this particular lecture paper is derived. In Stopper's work, he made a strong case, as well as others in the literature that I put here, if you can see my arrow, that the high-performing regions in the 1990s, early 1990s, were those that were characterized by having strong social institutional ensembles that in turn enable those regions to benefit from industrial specialization, perhaps in particular through learning and innovation-based clusters, and so on and so forth. And that, broadly conceived, is known as, if you like, the conventions approach to understanding collective learning and innovation in regional development. And that literature has very, very strong basis that in turn lead to the current strands of literature that we see in regional studies since the mid-2000s, whereby we have the development of evolutionary economic geography, in which today's one of the key ideas, relative variety, was developed in the 2007 paper by Franken et al., also published in regional studies. And in this strand of literature, and I suppose some of you are from the EEG audience, knowledge and innovation became the primary focus of understanding regional evolutionary change and path development. Meanwhile, there is another strand of literature during the same time period, roughly, that emerged in understanding regional development by trying to link regional actors and their, if you like, relational assets to the kind of actors and networks at extra-regional scales, if you like, the global scale. And this is the global production networks approach, which first of all emerged in the early 2000s. And some of the significant papers that were published, for example, Humphrey and Smith 2002 in regional studies, look at industrial upgrading and regional development. So again, both strands of literature were significant and associated with regional studies as a field. What I would like to do is that both strands of literature do not speak too much to each other. And I thought through this lecture, perhaps I can make an initial sympathetic attempt to, if you like, build some bridges across the two epistemic communities. Of course, given the time and space limited, I shall only speak about how perhaps GPN can inform EEG studies, and of course, leave the reverse flow to future papers, and of course, all those of you in the audience. Now, what I've done is to pick two of what I see as the best known new concepts emerging from the two strands of literature: relative variety in EEG, since Franken's paper in regional studies, which subsequently, of course, paved way for many studies of relative variety in regional diversification, and strategic coupling since Neelko et al.'s paper in Transactions of the IBG in 2004. And what I want to do is to showcase how perhaps the two strands of literature had, if you like, different conceptions of regional worlds. In the EEG literature, regional worlds are seen as more specialized, more endogenously oriented or driven, if you like, whatsoever the variety. Whereas in GPN studies, regions are seen as, if you like, more porous, more interconnected with elsewhere through firm-specific production networks. So this is how I see as the beginning of the different strands of literature and their characteristics. Of course, since Franco's paper in 2007 in regional studies, which I think now is one of the top 5 papers cited in regional studies ever, there have been many, many studies of relative variety in regional diversification. In Ron Boschma's papers 10 years down the road, which was, of course, was based on his Regional Studies Annual Lecture 2015 at Chicago AAG, he argues that the literature on regional diversification has focused perhaps too much on local capabilities, right? As he put it, there might be a neglect of the role of extra-regional linkages and actors that might affect regional diversification. And of course, coming from a kind of more extra-regional approach, I fully concur with his assessment. Now, what Boschma recommends in that 2017 paper, Dieter was the commentator actually, that there might be a more micro perspective by focusing on firms and in particular transnational corporations and their foreign direct investment. Since then, there have been many papers related, published in various journals, regional studies, journal economic geography, and economic geography. So many of these papers look at how inward foreign direct investments through transnational corporation activities impact on regional development, regional diversification. My critique of this is that regional transformation, if you like, extra regional linkages are not necessarily dependent on inward TNC activities. It can also be about regional actors as TNCs going out, or regional actors as non-TNC based activity through developing inter-firm partnership and cooperative relationship with firms elsewhere. Why? because there is significant geographical fragmentation of production on a worldwide scale, such that regional actors need not have to conduct extra-regional linkages through investments. It can be through also other forms of partnership and cooperative relationships. I will develop this a little bit more later on in the main sections. So what this kind of extra-regional linkages might be, will be the kind of inter-firm networks of production that, as I mentioned, enable us to understand how regional actors can plug into network activities outside the region. Robert Hassin, in his more recent regional studies paper, also argues that EEG frameworks could perhaps benefit from such integration of insights from the literature on global production, as well as innovation networks and so on and so forth. So I'm kind of standing on the various shoulders and approaches in order to develop these lectures ideas. What I would like to do is to argue that GPN studies perhaps could offer a platform to reconcile this coexistence of both endogenous, if you like, relational assets and exogenous sources of regional change. So in this approach, we can see how perhaps regional actors develop extra local linkages through strategic coupling as a new mechanism. And that mechanism, I would like to argue, adds on to existing mechanisms of related variety, which I will explain a little bit later on. And hence, what we can do is to think of how regions can develop extra local linkages through complementary interfirm network relationships that are embedded in global production networks. To do that, we need to rethink what regional worlds means. So regional worlds cannot just mean endogenous, localized production ensembles, but also territorialized networks of interconnections. So I would like to expand this notion of regional worlds as worlds of interconnections that capitalize on both region-specific assets, or if you like, intra-regional, as well as tap into extra-regional markets, production capabilities, and flows of people, capital, and technology. So in that sense, we might be able to think of how regional diversification can occur through strategic coupling, whereby regional actors, through related variety, engage in activities with partners elsewhere. And it's that focus that I would like to develop in today's presentation. Now, let me then go into greater detail about regional worlds. Michael Stopper made seminal contributions through not just the 1993 paper, which I mentioned, but also his two very important books published in 1997, in which he developed very, very strong and well-established convention-based views of regional worlds. To him, at least in those works, he saw, if you like, regional specialization as a form of endogenous attribute, whereby regions have very specific sets of conventions and norms that enable those regions to develop specialization in particular ways. And in his 1997 The Regional World book, he argues that such convention-based conceptions of regional world help us to understand how regions specialize and become major, powerful, performing regions. So he defines such conventions as local worlds of production. And to him, that world consists of practices, institutions, and material objects. But it also enables forms of cognition, theories, doctrines, institutions, and rules. I've highlighted some of the bullets in bold of those areas where Stopper thought that such conventions matter in explaining superior regional performance. Certain patterns of regional mobilization, certain forms of collective order that enable cooperation, strong conventions for product quality, strong innovating groups and their cooperation with others, as well as the harmonization of preference structures among regional actors, and strong cultures and ideologies of local economic actors. And I think by now, these are very well-known sets of conventions in the literature. In the same book, interestingly, he also presaged what we subsequently know as evolutionary economic geography, whereby he actually drew upon Nelson and Winter's 1982 book of Evolutionary Theories of Economic Change to explain what Stopper calls technological dynamism and local conventions. So the quotation I pull out from his book shows clearly that he was thinking at that time already, if you look at the second sentence, whereby the region must be a place where technological variety is created and then limited, whereas the pathway is traced out. So in that sense, he actually already presaged the idea of variety to a certain extent and pathway development as much of evolutionary economic geography is debating nowadays as well. Now, however, I see this particular model of regional world, which is more specialization model, if you like, as having two major drawbacks. Of course, this is only with hindsight in relation to what we know by today, 2+ decades of further research. One is that this particular specialization model sees regions as more territorial containers of relational assets. So that, of course, has ramification with other literature known as what is called the new regionalism, for example, much in regional studies and economic geography, whereby it tends to analytically foreclose the possibility of regions actually connecting with extra-local linkages, as we are arguing as of today. There were some earlier critiques like in Bano and Co., McKinnon and Bethel's papers, all published in Progress in Human Geography. Stopper also responded to some of this in his 2009 Rupke lecture in Economic Geography, published in Economic Geography, as well as another paper in more recent years published in JEG, looking at how regions might be seen as a context for such technological dynamism, or regions might be seen as self-contained separate worlds, as in his terms. But I still think that overall, most of these papers by Michael Stopper tend to look at regions as territorial containers rather than, if you like, interconnections among regions. So what I see this drawback is that it may lead to also a second issue whereby there seems to be a hierarchy of world regions whereby the technologically much more advanced regions will always, because of certain conventions and localized assets, be on this sort of pecking order as the leading regions, whereas the laggard regions will always be the laggard regions, so to speak. And of course, we know that in the literature, there is much more work now done on technological change and economic catch-up. So in short, regions should not be seen as static, self-contained containers, if you like. And I will argue that there might be too much explanatory power given to what Stopper calls the absolute advantage based on superior localized technological learning. Now, so how do we go beyond this, if you like, specialization model of regional worlds? In fact, Stopper himself argues that his purpose of setting up that particular model is to enhance the explanatory power of regionalist social science, if you like, regional studies, so that we can make distinctive contribution to contemporary social sciences, which I think is a very admirable goal, which I hope all of us can continue and bring this forward. To me, I think the debate as of today we know of is to think of regional change in the world of interdependence, right? And I think what we all have experienced in the past 2 or 3 months is in itself a strong testimony to that great interdependence across the world. So regions, no regions, if you like, can be self-contained islands in today's much interconnected, deeply interdependent global economy. And Peter Dickens' Global Shift through many successive editions have shown us how those dependencies works. So to me, the key question is how do regions evolve and develop through different value capture trajectories in relation to actors in regions participating in global production networks. And that to me seems to be one of the important ways whereby we can reconcile those differences I mentioned at the beginning. And here we need to develop a bit further a particular conception of regional worlds towards what might be called a more relational view. GPN studies tend to take on that relational view perhaps more strongly, partly because it's looking at organizational structures beyond a particular region. So GPNs are obviously defined as an organizational arrangement. It's just an arrangement, a particular mode of organizing economic activities that involve, if you like, economic and non-economic actors in different parts of the world, broadly speaking. So to GPN scholars, the global economy made up of, generally is seen as comprising different regions, multiple regions, but these regions, whatever the conventions are stitched together through those cross-regional production networks that are orchestrated or led by specific powerful firms. That recognition is becoming very important in today's international organizations, ranging from WTO to UNCTAD to McKinsey and so on and so forth. And of course, right now we are experiencing major restructuring of those activities, and nobody knows for sure what will happen in the, if you like, post-COVID-19 global economy. So what I'm trying to push for is to think of regions as interconnected worlds. So regional worlds are interconnected, whereby activities in one particular region tend to have organizational relationships with what's happening in other regions. So this idea of multiple worlds stitch together the earlier world understanding of regional world as highly specialized with the sort of later, more contemporary view of regions as globalized production. So regions are microcosms, if you like, that internalize these diverse flows and linkages that bring together both competitive dynamics of regional actors, as well as access to, if you like, global innovation and other kind of market and financial networks elsewhere. And I would argue this approach is slightly different, if not significantly different from early relational view of regions in, say, the Ray Massey, John Allen, and others' work that tend to focus on intranational social relations of production between regions within the same country, if you like, with some exception, all right? And I would also like to argue that this sort of relational view of regional worlds as interconnected worlds is seeing production networks not as just the context for regional specialization, but actually as the fundamental co-constitutive elements of regional development, unlike Stopper's argument. So in his rookie lecture, Stopper actually asked rhetorically that if Hollywood were a global production network with no local core, would it be the same industry as it is with its present organization and geography? So just bear in mind this question that Michael asked about 10 years ago, all right? And I would like to argue that, in fact, you can't separate global production networks out of, if you like, Hollywood, as if global production networks are a separate entity, all right? Why? Because I believe that such networks co-constitute regional worlds. Regional worlds are co-constitutive with such production networks across the globe. So regional worlds are not just sort of distributed contexts for GPN and vice versa. And hence the question is not whether Hollywood has a local core. Hollywood, by its very existence, must have a local core. It's both a territorialized contestation of multiple GPNs in the motion picture industry, for example, and a highly innovative regional world, well blessed by what is arguably the superior local core. But even that local core, as we know, the creative talents in Hollywood are not purely US born and or origin as well. So it's multinational in nature in the first instance. And there are many studies in other industries that showcases how, for example, high growth regions, its very development is connected with, if you like, production network activities elsewhere. Okay, so I've summarized this sort of view in this particular figure, whereby you will see that there are two regions, regional world A and regional world B. Regional world A and B both have, if you like, the holy trinity as Michael argued in his work, technology, industrial organization, and territorialized politics and institutions. In the past, we will see regional world A transform through diversification or other means. However, in this figure, I would like to argue that regional world, both A and B, participate in global production network activities that do not just serve as the context for regional A and B. Instead, there is some kind of transformation through their participation in GPN activities that in turn leads to different outcomes. Specialization in region A through related variety, value capture trajectory, through perhaps resurgence of industrial upgrading and so on and so forth. Whereas region B, through its participation, experience more a diversification into new industry, perhaps unrelated, perhaps also not necessarily conducive to sustainable development. And of course, there are always dark sides to such transformation. So this is just a figure to sort of broaden a particular view of regional world from the kind of endogenous to connecting to GPN activities to transformations. So this is how this conceptualization, to me, matters in helping us to reconcile the idea of relative variety and strategic coupling, as I will develop in the next section. So just to sum up this major section is that to see regions as interconnected worlds. And I think a necessary and sufficient condition for analyzing regional change is about looking at both internal dynamics for change as well as extra-regional linkages or opportunities associated with global production activities. And I think such an integrative approach can help us to also explain and examine in greater detail regional evolution through tracking whether it's related or unrelated diversification, and to showcase whether these diversification initiatives, if you like, fit with or strategically coupled with the competitive dynamics of respective global production activities in different industries, for example. So in the third major section, I would like to now go into greater detail about regional relative variety and how, and showcase how it connects with strategic coupling as a possibility for explaining regional change. Here, I would like to sort of extend my recent argument published in Dialogues in Human Geography about the idea that perhaps in geographical understanding of regional change and uneven development, we can perhaps take on a more mechanism-based approach, whereby the search for causal mechanism rather than grand theories should be our primary, or at least one of the core primary objectives. And I believe the relative variety literature has helped us to understand a few very important mechanisms for change, and I will outline them later shortly. Here, I would like to see how perhaps such related diversification can take place also through extra-regional linkages. So in short, this reconciliation is to add on an additional mechanism for understanding related variety, not to replace the existing understanding of related variety. Now, again, that requires us to go back to Franco's original paper in regional studies and look at how related variety help us to understand regional growth. And to him and his co-authors, related variety refers to within sector knowledge spillover among firms. In other words, knowledge spillover innovative activities among firms in the region tend to be related because they are in similar sectors. To them, unrelated variety refers to a portfolio of knowledge flows between firms in different sectors within the same region. So this departs from the earlier, if you like, the 1990s view of regional worlds that focus on existing specializations in region. In fact, Franco and others, and subsequently much of the evolution economic geography work, is to track changes over time rather than just look at existing specialization. And I think that's important. And explaining regional evolution and diversification becomes the prime objective of this body of work, which of course, from a regional studies point of view, is extremely significant because it helps us to understand the creation of new specialization and pathways of development. In Boschma's subsequent regional studies journal paper and the annual, deriving from the annual lecture, he also noticed that there are actually many types of related variety. There is the technological relatedness, product relatedness, product market relatedness, skill relatedness, input-output relatedness, and so on and so forth. Now that brings out an issue. First is that obviously there is a lack of singular measurement of relatedness, which understandably could be due to data issue and related measurement problems. So as Boschma argues, there is no clear single measurement of relatedness, which in turn, of course, can create a little bit of confusion if you follow the outcomes. However, Boschma and others have also argued that regional diversification through related variety tends to be the norm. So unrelated diversification is rare, doesn't happen as often as related diversification. In a way that makes sense. Partly, we understand the idea of path dependence, so regions tend to renew based on existing related industries and activities. And hence, for regions to develop completely through unrelated variety, such as new path development, creation of entirely new sectors and products, it tends to be difficult, it tends to be risky, and so on and so forth, as shown in some of the recent papers by these colleagues in the various journals, regional studies, JEG, and economic geography. Now, to me, there are two conceptual and methodological issues that perhaps need to be addressed further. One is that I think the idea of relative variety in regional diversification tends to focus too much on endogeneity within the region. As Boschma argued in his other paper in regional studies that tried to develop a theory of regional diversification, that the notion of regional variety is related to existing capabilities within the region. So in so doing, this particular body of work within the EEG literature tends not to take extra-regional network relationship as necessary to such measurement of relative variety. In other words, regions develop or diversify through related or unrelated means without considering its linkages with elsewhere. But of course, my question is whether regions can actually be an island without any connections to the wider global economy. And the argument is that it might be a problem to think in that way. Second is that there are units of analysis tends to focus more on individual actors and firms within regions, such as, all the way from patent data that look at scientists and inventors to productivity data, input measurements on firms and performance within specific industries. Others have argued that, and because of this, Boschma et al. In this particular paper in regional studies towards a theory of regional diversification, interestingly, calls for a bricolage approach, whereby they argue that it's perhaps useful to consider the multiplicity of actors embedded in networks who collectively draw on a broad set of distributed resources, so on and so forth. So it seems to me that they are also pushing for networks as a meso-level unit of analysis, which I think perhaps suits the kind of intersection between EEG and GPN studies. And this is what I would like to sort of develop in the final section of the presentation. First, let me go back to Boschma's 2017 paper, not the annual lecture paper, but the other paper that look at towards the theory of regional diversification, in which he, Lars, and Cohen, and Bernhard have developed, if you like, 4 specific mechanisms for understanding regional diversification. They argue that replication, acceptation, transplantation, and saltation can help us to understand how, if you like, different regional pathways can be taken. Replication tends to mean branching into related industries. You replicate existing capabilities. Acceptation is about creating new niches based on existing or related knowledge. And both are about related diversification. Transplantation is about something new transplanted into this region, which are unrelated to existing knowledge base. And of course, the last one is very hard to occur. It doesn't occur often, is saltation, which tends to have a radical breakthrough that occur in specific regions that lead to completely new industries, and so on and so forth. They've developed a table that explains all of this, which I do not have time to go into detail, but just to show you that they have actually specified, if you like, how each of these mechanisms work in terms of relatedness, sectors, risks, institutional work, key actors, and spatial logics. What I've done is to kind of juxtapose these 4 mechanisms, all right, in relation to GPN understanding of strategic coupling, to see whether there is some interesting result that can come out. And I see that there are some overlap, not overlap, there are some complementarities between the 2 approaches in terms of understanding mechanisms of regional change. Now remember, the earlier 4 mechanisms of regional diversification look at happenings within the region, and GPN studies tend to look at, if you like, interconnections between regions and actors elsewhere in global production networks. In my 2009 paper in regional studies, I've specified some of these, if you like, forms or modes of coupling. And in the subsequent work developed in NeoCo, we specify further many different modes of strategic coupling that can take place, such as indigenous coupling within core regions, functional upgrading with partners in emerging regions, and structural upgrading, coupling through a provision of production platforms. And in this table, which of course you won't be able to see everything, is that I've sort of combined the 2 approaches, so to speak, by outlining how core regions through indigenous coupling takes a more inside out, developing core activities in the region, having strong control and autonomy, and venture out. If you like, the kind of outward-oriented regional expansion and diversification. In so doing, achieving replication, acceptation, and in very rare cases, perhaps sortation. In a more emerging region, you have functional coupling whereby actors in this region couple with, if you like, global production activities elsewhere through performing specific functions along, if you like, the value chain. Here, you take both inside out as well as outside in approaches. Inside out refers to actors within region going out. Outside in refers to core regions, actors coming in perhaps through foreign direct investment and TNC activities. And here you see examples of replication and acceptations, which I will explain briefly with an example. And finally, in more peripheral regions, you often see outside in, FDI, TNC coming in. There is great dependency on those activities. Development tends to take place in the form of transplantation because these activities tend not to be too related to existing activities and assets in the region. And of course, there are different levels of relatedness and spillover and so on and so forth. Now, these are all fairly abstract. Let me give you a more stylized example of looking at how Silicon Valley and its regional diversification, if you like, is connected to Silicon Valley actors and their activities with their East Asian partners. In this particular example, I will show you how horizontal interfirm relationships, which are not FDI based, if you like, as well as vertical intrafirm activities take place across these two regions of the world. So in the following diagram, which is derived from our GPN 2015 book, I've looked at how regional world A refers to the home of global lead firm in a particular global production networks, say the United States and Silicon Valley. And regional world B, say Taiwan, and a particular region, say Hsinchu, Taipei region. And both regions are interconnected through own production activities of this particular global lead firm. Later on, you will know it's HP, and it's the production by strategic partner, SP. So their activities, interrelationships, connect happenings, development pathways, diversification possibilities of the two regions, so to speak. Now, this example of HP in the Silicon Valley in this, I'm focusing on, say, notebook PC production only, and its strategic partners in Taiwan, help us to see how such interconnections may help to understand Silicon Valley's diversification, so to speak. Now, such coupling is generally known as a partnership model in the earlier table. It tried to help us to understand how extra-regional linkages function through such coupling mechanism, whereby we do not have foreign direct investment in terms of manufacturing by HP in Taiwan, and vice versa, not by its manufacturing partners in Taiwan in Silicon Valley. This is an extra regional linkage, if you like, without, so to speak, direct TNC activities in that sense of the word. Why? Because they engage in cooperative organizational arrangements whereby there is a great deal of what is known as outsourcing of design and manufacturing of notebook production. I've given the empirical details of this example. You can find it in my Cornell 2016 book, but here I shall just focus on two outcomes. One is regional diversification in Silicon Valley, whereby HP, through outsourcing its notebook production, is able to then move into high value function activities such as software and enterprise services, as well as develop niche products rather than notebook per se, because somebody else in Taiwan is doing the job for you, that then you can specialize in something else which is still related to your expertise, but mission critical servers and so on and so forth. So this to me is a form of acceptation. Meanwhile, the wider region can also benefit from the higher complexity of knowledge and technology development associated with lead firms like HP, that is able to, if you like, diversify into some of its more high value added products and services. And of course, meanwhile, the region also sees the emergence of new firms in software, such as Google, chip design, such as NVIDIA, again, relying on manufacturing partners in Asia, in particular Taiwan, in related industries. So many of these firms are able to branch into related industries in digital platforms, gaming, entertainment system, of course, today, advanced automotives, through having developed global production network partnership with producers elsewhere. Meanwhile, in Taiwan, the region Hsinchu Taipei also benefit from this particular mode of regional diversification through what is known as replication, whereby domestic manufacturers that used to manufacture calculators, computer peripherals, such as Compal, is able to then move into much more advanced design and manufacturing of notebook PCs. So some of the notebook PC ODM partners came out of having experience in making calculators, so to speak. There are others that benefit from replication through developing complex products, such as display panels, power systems, and so on and so forth. So this might well be seen as the kind of input-output relatedness typically seen in EEG studies. And of course, over time, such sort of production network arrangements has also been transplanted through the relocation of the more assembly work from Taiwan's Taipei Hsinchu region to China's East Coast, in Kunshan, Shanghai, as well as in West Coast, in Chengdu and Chongqing, that became major clusters of notebook PC assembly driven by this kind of production activity. So we see that as transplantation. And in other words, you have regional diversification happening through transplantation of labor intensive assembly work to elsewhere. I think similar stories can also be found in semiconductors, whereby you will see that the fabless chip design firms like Qualcomm and Broadcom work with Taiwan's TSMC. Again, such sort of cross-regional linkages help us to understand both regions' significant presence in semiconductors, as well as in mobile handset in terms of the relationship between TSMC and Apple, for example, and Foxconn from Taiwan, and so on and so forth. Currently, I'm working on this in great detail in a forthcoming book project on global electronics that likely to be contracted with Stanford University Press. They are meeting next week to see whether they will give me a book contract. We shall see. Okay, so I've explained this figure with the HP Taiwan example. I've explained some of the, if you like, pointers in this table. Of course, at the end of the day, I hope you will read the paper if eventually it comes out somewhere, hopefully in regional studies, of course, and so on and so forth. Now, let me conclude. First of all, I think the existing theory of regional diversification is incomplete without taking on those extra regional linkages. And as I argue in this lecture, those extra regional linkages can be understood perhaps as a form of strategic coupling with global production networks. So strategic coupling can be a mechanism for regional diversification through related variety. And I think that's useful for understanding, if you like, the diversification trajectories of home regions of both global lead firms such as HP, Apple, and what have you in Silicon Valley, and their strategic partner elsewhere. For example, in Taiwan, in China, in Southeast Asia, as well as in Mexico, Latin America, and so on and so forth. And I believe that such strategic coupling can occur through some of those component mechanisms as theorized in Boschma's 2017 paper. So what might be the future agenda? Let me see how many I have. My time's up probably. Okay, so I shall be very brief here on the future agenda. I have three agendas I shall just briefly go through. One is that perhaps we can think of a search for more integrative theory, whereby the existing theory of regional diversification seems to have explained quite detailed the different types of regional diversification rather than the industrial and organizational dynamics underpinning that typology. I think more conceptualization can take place, and I'm very glad that the existing studies by evolution economic geographers have continuously pushed that frontier. The example in GPN study will be the kind of theory of GPN that Neil Ko and myself try to develop in a parallel way. Second is that perhaps we can have a more robust conception of key units of analysis. I think the unit analysis issue will take a while to resolve. I understand that there is, of course, tremendous difficulty in quantifying much of the related variety and regional diversification measurements. It is a difficult thing, and hence, hopefully there will be new ways of making measurements either more accurate or more robust in understanding diversification and related variety. In fact, as Dieter himself argued that the collocation of two related products in the same region in his regional studies commentary do not necessarily mean that the producers are related, so to speak. So in that sense, we need more than just the co-presence of firms, actors, or industries. And personally, I would prefer, of course, taking a more network approach as the primary unit of measurement. And there are some existing papers that argue for such an approach in the study of regional diversification. I should just skip this one. I just make the final point about the conceptual question of value creation, enhancement, and capture. So again, Dieter's commentary on Ron's lecture argues that the EEG's noticeable failure is to explain how relatedness and so on and so forth can lead to economic progress and productivity gains. Robert Hastings' more recent paper also argues that EEG literature tends to focus attention on the positive effects of religiousness. Hardly any discussion about how the several, old regions, pathways, and may hinder development and so on and so forth. So I think the question of value creation and capture will matter tremendously in terms of helping us to understand, is regional diversification, or if you like, related diversification, a good thing or not? And in so doing, perhaps we have to look at the agents of change, as some of the recent papers shown about the importance of understanding agents of structural change in regions. We need to find out more about who exactly capture value from diversification, and why that diversification might be good for particular regions, and what are the conditions for, if you like, such goodness. Does it build resilience and evolution, and so on and so forth? So ultimately, we need to sort of take on a little bit more of the normative concerns in evolutionary thinking, in terms of not just us finding out the how and why, but also the so what question. On that note, I shall thank you very much and wish all of you healthy and well. I shall now pass on the mic back to headquarters. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Henry. That was a stimulating conversation, and we've already got a ton of questions. Before I hand off the microphone to our distinguished discussant, I just want to address some of the technical issues we've had during the beginnings of this. It looks like the webinar is currently live streaming on Facebook. So if you have colleagues who can't get into the webinar, they can watch it in real time there. It is also being recorded and will be posted by the Regional Studies Association. So participants will get a note. If you registered, you'll get a note about that. It also looks like we potentially may have lifted the cap on the webinar. There are some technical difficulties about caps of how many people can participate. So if you want to try to get in again, feel free to try to do that, but otherwise you can be watching live in Facebook. The difference right now will be whether or not a question can get posted, right? So you need to be engaged in the webinar in order to use the Q&A function within Zoom here. So with that, I will pass the microphone along, and we look forward to our discussant.
Well, thank you very much, Jennifer, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you very much to the Regional Studies Association and to Regional Studies, the journal, for having me to discuss this very interesting paper and presentation by Henry Young. And I will start by saying that this intervention by Henry that should have taken place at the AAG in Denver and is now being cast from the comfort of our homes, aims to link what are mutually reinforced, what are the two possibly most influential strands in regional studies and economic geography in the last 2 decades. On the one hand, we have the prominent evolutionary economic geography approach put together by, among others, Ron Bosma, Kuhn Frenken, Lamboy, Ron Martin, etc., and which has grown into what is now a fundamental framework and has developed a number of concepts from knowledge and innovation in regional evolution, the importance of different types of distances, path dependency, and the role of relative variety and complexity in regional diversification that are helping transform the way we see economic geography. And this strand has provided a much more dynamic perspective into how we understand the location and the evolution of economic activity in space. The other prominent strand is the global production networks that has been based on the work of Henderson, Humphrey and Smith, Neil Coe, and Martin Hess, and not least, of course, the work of Henry Young, and which has developed an approach based on the relevance of regional actors and assets, putting in center stage the competitive advantage of engaging in global production networks as a way to improve industrial promotion and promote development. As I said, both strands have shaped and will continue to shape the way we see economic geography. However, and this is interesting, despite their influence, despite their relevance within our discipline, they have run in what Henry calls parallel tracks with very, very limited interaction and cross-fertilization. In my view, this represents a massive waste of resources because both approaches have a lot of potential synergies and a lot to offer to one another in trying to build, and therefore trying to build bridges between them will help propel regional studies to a new dimension. The question is, how can this be done? Well, I have two so influential strands within our discipline for so long, and despite notable exceptions that are mentioned by Henry in the paper, have they ignored one another? How can we as a discipline bind these two very highly influential strands together in a way that gives regional studies a new boost and a new, in a certain way, direction? Henry Young highlights in this lecture that he will concentrate on what global production networks can offer to evolution economic geography rather than the other way around. He claims that he will leave the reverse task for a later date or for all other well-meaning researchers. I hope he doesn't, not in this paper, but I want to see another paper as interesting as this one as soon as possible, because I think it would be highly complementary to what you're doing. But I can understand this because after all, Henry's one of the main proponents of global production networks, and it's easier within the space afforded by and the time limitations of a conference, of a presentation of a webinar in this case, and putting then everything into a journal article to concentrate on what you know best, what he knows best, and what the global production network strand can offer to evolution economic geography. I would just say that his starting point is that what he thinks, and I agree with him, the two strands have in common. That is Michael Storper's, but not just Michael's, regional worlds framework. A framework in which a local context, local institutional constructs, collective learning and innovation are at the root of economic specialization and diversification and lead to changes in the location of economic activity. I will go back to that later on. He also claims that, following Bosma, that the regional world framework and the global production networks approach can help overcome what, in his view, and in Ron Bosma's view, is one of the main weaknesses of evolution economic geography until today, which is the concentration on local characteristics and a certain neglect of the role of extra-local connections, linkages, and actors as a driver of transformation of economic activity. In other words, he's claiming that evolution economic geography is neglecting how external linkages and anticipation in networks can become a fundamental shaper of transformations in relative variety, regional diversification, and increases in local economic complexity. This is where he suggests that global production networks can fill in an important gap in explaining relative variety in regional diversification, mainly by going beyond transnational corporations and the work they're doing, and zooming much more directly into the role of all types of firm-level strategic regional linkages and the creations of networks and partnerships. In fact, what Henry Young aims to address is, following his seminal work with Neil Coe in 2015, how the participation of regions in networks that spread beyond the national borders and often encompass the whole world can become a catalyst in the transformation of local economies, that is, in the evolution of economic activity, both at the local level, but as a result of that, at the global level. In order to do that, he goes in search of what I think is fundamental, which are the mechanisms that can produce that synergy, and finds that mechanisms, that key mechanism, in the whole idea of coupling, strategic coupling. Strategic coupling is a fundamental global production network literature concept through which trans-regional mechanisms can shape local economic development, trans-regional connections. And strategic coupling adopts very different forms in different types of cities and different types of region. It is different in core regions, it's from how it is developed and achieved in emerging areas and in peripheral regions. And he argues that this different type of strategic coupling, or these different types of strategic coupling of regional firms and institutions can play a fundamental role. They can be a fundamental market mechanism for accelerating changes in relative variety and moving towards the path of greater diversification, helping in this way to fuel the transformations at the heart of evolutionary economic geography. This is certainly a very, very interesting exercise and one that is clearly worth pursuing. Henry is very successful at whetting our appetite for greater need to build bridges across strands in economic geography and in regional studies, and especially across strands that have shaped the way we now see the factors behind the uneven distribution of economic activity across the world. However, I'm sure I'm not just invited as a discussant to give praise to what Henry has done, which is very interesting. And I'm sure that Henry would understand that I have some queries. And I would suggest that there are two important areas in which his effort to build bridges requires greater attention. These two concern the main mechanisms through which engaging in global production systems and engaging in networks can yield a desired transformation for economic actors and firms that participate in these networks, and as a result, as a way to transform the economies of regions and cities across the world. These two related areas are, first of all, the role of networks and specifically understanding better the mechanisms of how networks contribute to the generation and diffusion of innovation. There's a lot of innovation in the paper, there's a lot, it appears the word, but we don't know exactly what the mechanisms are. And I think it will be important to delve into that. The second one is the capacity of our cities and regions to assimilate the benefits of innovation diffusion through networks, which is something that Henry's leaving for a future work. This is what he calls capture, that I think is fundamental in this stage. Concerning the former, that's the idea of the role of networks in the generation and diffusion of innovation. Engaging in networks is not costless. We all agree that networks facilitate the diffusion of knowledge, both codified and tacit, and contribute to the transfer of innovation. But it is also very, very well documented that engaging in networks is costly, both from a monetary, but also from a time perspective, and that very often networks can lead to locking and therefore become unproductive. This is more likely to be the case at the local level for weaker, for smaller actors, and very often also in less auspicious economic and institutional contexts. Hence, the geographical dimension of networks is not trivial. Extra-regional and extra-national networks, we all know, tend to lead to greater innovation and to a deeper transformation of local economies than the existence of local networks. But they are also far more difficult to engage with, far more difficult to construct, and they demand better conditions for economic actors and firms to be involved in them. This is something that evolutionary economic geography has not neglected. We just have to go back to the French School of Distance and the seminal work of Norm Bosma in his 2005 article, when he looked at the role of different distances in shaping the potential returns of interaction. But possibly the geographical distance is the costliest of all distances to engage with, especially in the absence between actors of greater social, institutional, organizational, or even ethnic proximity. This is something that would deserve a greater attention, as the pipelines described by other authors like Harold Battle, Anders Malmberg, or Peter Marskell in 2003-2004 have a very uneven level of development, depending not just on the characteristics of the agents and firms involved in the network, but also on local context. And this brings me to the second point, which is the capacity to absorb any sort of knowledge and innovation that is being funneled through the pipelines into the local context. This is what Henry calls the process of capture, although I think it's a bit broader. This requires a minimum threshold of collective learning. So a word that appears is central in Michael Stolper's regional world or in Kevin Morgan's learning region, but that is, in my view, conspicuously absent from Henry's contribution, although it's mentioned twice, but is never developed in any depth. Here, I think that two dimensions need to be considered. The first one is related to human capital and human resources. There's a need to answer important questions, to ask and answer important questions about who participates in those networks. What are their characteristics? What are their motivations, their goals? Who has to assimilate the benefits of, or who can assimilate the benefits of that new information and innovation? The group that is bound to capture the benefits is likely to be far larger than the group engaging in the networks, and therefore understanding the interaction between both groups and analyzing the capture mechanisms of those receiving the benefits of networks is key for strategic coupling in order to make a difference in the transformation of local economies. The second dimension is the institutional dimension, which is mentioned frequently, as especially by Michael Stolper. It's also mentioned in the paper, but it's hardly developed again. So what type of institutions are required? Is it just a factor of having good formal institutions, or do informal institutions play as important a role, if not more important, in the development of this strategic coupling and those networks? Do we need to focus just on on the institutional quality of the place of destination? Or does the difference between the institutional quality of the place of origin and the place of destination play a part in, first, the formation of networks, and second, in the capacity of localities to capture that knowledge and innovation being funneled through the network? Weak institutions, especially in emerging and less developed economies, can rapidly unravel any benefits linked to participation in global pipelines and global networks. We're seeing, for example, that large special economic zones very often have no or a limited impact on the surrounding environment, mostly as a result of a combination of weak human capital and poor local institutions. Therefore, there is a need to understand in a far better way by both the global production networks literature and the evolution economic geography approach, how the benefits of belonging to a global network can be assimilated, received, and captured at a local level, as any attempt to reach out to the rest of the world by local economic actors, by firms and by local agents, can very, very quickly dissolve if the context in which these actors operate are either hostile or simply unfavorable. I believe that if these two factors can be taken into consideration by Henry, and not just by Henry, but the most of us working on these topics, considerable progress would be made in our understanding of how local economies evolve and transform themselves into something new from existing conditions. This is where I think that significant new progress can be made, and I would therefore encourage, but I would also challenge Henry to, after this what is a very insightful step into bringing these two strands together, I would challenge you to delve even further into these and other aspects in order to make sure that your work can continue to help increase even further your already large contribution to our understanding of how urban and regional economies across the world work. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that, for the constructive critique there from our discussant. I very much appreciate it. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask Henry to perhaps absorb all of that and turn to a couple of questions before we have to close at the 30-minute mark, probably more like the 28-minute mark here, to make sure that the technology doesn't cut us off. But just to summarize a couple of questions that have been coming through, we have quite a few questions, so I'm going to try to consolidate a bit. One of the dominant questions that's coming through really has to do with this question of whether or not our speakers think that given the deglobalization trend that is occurring with the COVID-19 pandemic, whether you think the coming reality will look more like decoupling instead of coupling. So variations on that question. And Henry, if you'd like to start with a response to that.
Okay, thank you. First of all, thank you to so much to Andras, my dear friend, for very insightful comments. And there is much work that needs to be done. And thanks to, I see Ron Boschma in the Q&A as well. Thanks to Ron for your wonderful support. It matters a lot. Okay, going back to the specific question about deglobalization and decoupling. Wow. Personally, again, and also having very, very deep understanding of the electronics industry, because I'm working on the book that I've very detailed data all the way up to second quarter of 2019 last year. I don't think decoupling can easily take place without great sacrifice in, if you like, economic efficiencies. So if you, in certain industry, of course, it's possible, right? So say making masks, then of course it's possible to make masks in America as well as in Singapore, actually. But if you are talking about, again, bringing the iPhone back to America, that kind of decoupling, I just think that is very, very difficult. There are many issues to be resolved, whether it's technological, economic, as well as organizational. So my short answer is that personally, I really don't think decoupling can take place easily. And by the way, it will take 5-10 years for things to move. I've been following a lot of news during this period, New York Times, BBC, and others, South China Morning Post. There are many claims that, yes, there are firms that are trying to leave China, for example. Well, but they will have left China anyway without COVID because China is not getting cheap. So it's not necessarily a kind of decoupling as we are thinking. It's what we call restructuring of global production networks. So my short answer then is to say, deglobalization and decoupling initiatives are still very much uncertain. Companies are not sure what exactly they want to do and can do. And with COVID in play, it makes it even more uncertain. As we know, uncertainty is very bad for business. Yeah. So that will be my response to this question. Thank you.
Andras, do you want to respond as well?
We got limited time. I think it's probably Henry's time to deal with all the questions because there are quite a lot of very interesting questions. So I leave it to him.
Okay, absolutely. So another question that's coming up a number of times in a number of different ways has to do with the issue of how to think about research on global production networks and strategic coupling and associated diversity and how we think about raw materials industries, particularly energy. So the question of how this framework works for raw material and energy industries and particularly energy transformation.
Tough question. I need Gavin Bridge here. So, but unfortunately, Gavin is not here, who's the real expert on this. I've seen some of those questions in the Q&A column. Actually, it's quite difficult to deal with them with just, if you like, short answers, partly because in many of these raw material or oil and gas, as well as, if you like, natural resource industries, GPN activities are much, how to put it, are not so evident because it's unlike the production of hardware, so to speak. So if you look at services or raw material industries or hotel, for example, tourism, things like that, it's not easy to unpack, if you like, the power dynamics as we understand it in global production network theory. So it's because of that, I can't really give you a simple, easy answer, except to say it has to be very context specific because certain type of extractive industries, for example, have very dominant relationship between, say, the state, the whole state, as well as a particular foreign firm. So the relationship doesn't encompass the whole range of GPN relationship that we normally talk about. And hence, again, example like that will be very different from those that are much more extensive, globally widespread kind of, say, in the petroleum refinery industry, for example. So that would be my answer.
Thank you very much. And this is an interesting question about the impact and dispersion of this concept. Would you say that strategic coupling could be a traveling concept to be used in other disciplines? It is a good fit for regional studies, but also in innovation studies, for instance.
Oh, okay, that's an interesting way of looking at it. I'm not too sure. I mean, I occasionally read, for example, Research Policy, the journal, which of course is one of the major journals in that field. I don't see there is a great deal of discussion part of strategic coupling, partly because I think when, as I mentioned earlier, the idea of strategic coupling was first developed in the 2004 paper in Transactions, whereby we were looking at regional development. So if you like, the key dependent variable was regional development. It wasn't about innovation per se. And that's why I do not necessarily think this is sort of easy to give a direct translation, because I think strategic coupling refers to coupling between actors such as firms, institutions, whereas I think innovation per se is not an actor, but an outcome of actors coming together, doing things together, so to speak. So I think there might need a kind of component mechanism to connect this idea of strategic coupling to, say, innovation per se. Thank you.
Thank you. And I think we can end on one last question here, which is an interesting one that refers directly to something that you mentioned in your talk, which is place leadership. But you didn't elaborate it on a lot. So there is a question here about what you think the significance is, your opinion of the role of place leadership on related, unrelated, and strategic coupling.
Agree. I think place leadership to me is very, very important. I mean, coming from a city-state that has a significant role of the state, leadership is the in thing, as we all know, in this world of uncertainty. Of course, by place leadership, we mean perhaps more local form of leadership. One of the key issues that actually Andreas also mentioned earlier. And I think place-based leadership is extremely important in enabling regional or local actors in, if you like, finding the kind of, one may argue, right networks to connect with. If you were to branch out and develop extra local linkages. Of course, place leadership can also take a more myopic view that leads to places, regions going inward, and in so doing, perhaps miss opportunities that can be brought about through those extra local linkages. And hence, I will argue, of course, place leadership is extremely important. And hence, how do we study it in regional studies? For example, if you like, the unpacking of this kind of administrative capacity as well as visionary views among, if you like, local actors, again, depending on specific locations, whereby local place-based actors could be taking a much more sort of democratic form, much more fragmented, for example, could also take a much more sort of power-driven, top-down approach, hierarchical approach. So I will see place leadership as an extremely important, I will probably see it as more enabling condition for strategic coupling, for diversification to take place, hopefully successfully. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. And we are near the end of our time, and I want to thank our panelists and our speakers. I want to thank our incredible staff at the Regional Studies Association for dealing with all of the amazing production here, and all of our listeners and participants for their patience as we've pulled together our regional studies community here for this wonderful discussion. So thank you all for being here. Thank you for participating. And we will get off the stage. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.